Uh, my name is Ezra Corman from Makor Educational Journeys in Jerusalem. We're a division of IGT. Both Makor and IGT at the moment really have no incoming travel, as you all know. And we decided a while ago to have a series of presentations that would try and give a sense a bit beneath the surface of things that are going on in Israel, things that are going on in the Jewish world. And we're very, very glad to have with us Yossi Klein Halevi today, who, as many, if not most of you know, is really one of the Jewish world's preeminent thinkers at the moment, someone who always tries to move in new directions, break through new frameworks. And he shares that with us through his articles, through those of you that have come to Israel and have had the opportunity to hear him through his speaking engagements and through his books. And what Yossi will talk about today is his book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. As with all of his books, a challenging book, and a book that relates to the core issues affecting Jews and Palestinians, Israelis and Palestinians living here today, potentially conflicting narratives, really conflicting narratives, but also in an attempt to try and see how it's possible to engage one with the other without negating the other. And it's quite an auspicious day. I know for those of you in the United States, we're watching from Israel what's been going on, and I have to say it is beyond comprehension what we see. For those of us in Israel, we're going through a very interesting time, and Yossi will share a few words about that with a new government, with new directions, new discussions, and also a horrific killing that took place in Jerusalem of an autistic Palestinian by police in Jerusalem on Saturday, on Shabbat. Not really an intentional or not intentional, that's not the point. It's just the horror of what all this is about. And Yossi's conversation today hopefully will raise some issues, raise some questions, and open up a palette for us to have a conversation. And so Yossi, I don't want to take up any more of your time. Bevakasha.
Ezra, and hi everyone. Delighted to be here, more or less with you all. I'd like to say just some words about this moment in Israel, and what we might expect as we head fitfully, unevenly toward the morning after in post-Corona Israel. My thoughts these days are actually more in your direction, and I never thought that I would be more worried about America than Israel. And I am today more worried about America. I'm desperately worried about Israel, but even more so about America. And I just watch with this feeling of horror and helplessness and love, because it really, when you see a society that you love going through such angst, and I'm sure you all have felt that in the other direction, watching Israel over the years, and to really feel that sense of helplessness and being left really with prayer. And so I send prayers to all of you and to your communities. Just a word about why Israel did reasonably well with Corona. Those of you who are following events here will know that we are having a bit of a relapse, but I think one can say that generally we've done well. And I think that this is one of the few moments where being a society under permanent siege was actually beneficial. It allowed us, first of all, to shut the country down very quickly, to be alert to threat very early on, because Israelis are used to having their antenna out for threat, and to be a society that was able to follow instructions. We are, in normal times, a hyper-anarchic society, but in moments of perceived threat, we tend to be very disciplined, and we tend to respond in a very quick and generally efficient way. And we did see that more or less play out here. The one great exception was the Haredi community, which lost a critical 2 weeks in its ability to mobilize. But something very interesting happened, which was that the Israeli army stepped in, placed Bnei Brak, the largest Haredi town, under curfew, and assumed the responsibility for feeding Bnei Brak. Not easy under any circumstances, given the stringent needs of Bnei Brak. Even more difficult on Pesach, on Passover, which is when the army placed Bnei Brak under curfew. But we saw this very interesting moment where Haredi rabbis lost something of their authority because they had misled their community, and they had told their communities that this was not going to be a big threat. All you need to do is continue to just business as usual, keep the yeshivas open, keep the synagogues open, and everything will be fine. And when that collapsed, it was the Israeli army that stepped in and essentially saved the day. So I think that there will be long-term positive consequences in the weakening of rabbinic authority in some parts of the Haredi community and the strengthening of the national authority. In terms of the other large peripheral community in Israel, and I'm speaking of the Israeli Arabs, this was an even more significant moment. This really was Israel's first existential or life and death crisis that had nothing to do with security, nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was our first civil crisis. And the Arab-Israeli community was uniquely positioned to take advantage of a civil crisis that was a health crisis. As the most integrated sector of Israeli society is the healthcare sector. 20+% of Israeli doctors are Arab, over 25% of our nurses are Arab, and over 50% of our pharmacists. And so this was exactly the right sector to handle the opportunity for bringing the Arab minority closer to the mainstream. And for the first time that I recall, the Israeli media treated Arabs as local heroes, as Israeli heroes, as exemplary citizens, by focusing on the doctors and the nurses and even the cleaning staff of hospitals. And so there really was this sense of embrace that Arab Israelis have felt from the Jewish mainstream, really for the first time, I would say, in the history of the state. And as a result of that, Arab Israelis responded accordingly. A poll was taken a few weeks ago by the Israel Democracy Institute, which showed that 77% of Arab Israelis regard their own personal faith be entwined with the faith and the well-being of the state of Israel. Only 11% of Arab Israelis call themselves Palestinian. I think that's an all-time low. Now, Ezra mentioned earlier the police shooting, the killing of an autistic young man who they mistook for a terrorist. And these kinds of incidents always reverberate in the Arab-Israeli community and impact on the level of Israeliness that the community feels it can own. Nevertheless, I think that something has opened up in the last months, a possibility of a genuine shared civil space between Arabs and Jews, neutral space that we can call Israeliness, that again, we've never experienced before. So in that sense, it may sound strange to say, but Corona has provided Israel with an unprecedented opportunity. Whether we take full advantage of that or not, I would feel more confident if we had a different government. But as we say in Hebrew, ze ma yesh, that's what we have. And so I'll say a few words about what we have, what this government is. This is the most unloved government in Israel's history. And I say that because no one wanted this government. Certainly not the people who head it. Gantz did not want this government. Netanyahu did not want this government. The people who voted for Likud and the people who voted for blue and white, none of us wanted this government. And this is a bloated, distorted, in many ways disgraceful government. Netanyahu picked apart ministries and arbitrarily separated functions to create artificial new ministries in order to placate his supporters, to hand out ministries to those in the Likud who he felt indebted to. This at a time when hundreds of thousands of Israelis are out of work. This is the most expensive government, the most, in some ways, the most useless government we've ever had. And yet, for all of that, a majority of Israelis support creating this government. And as broken-hearted as I am about the collapse of the center and Gantz's decision to effectively destroy the centrist blue and white as the most effective centrist party that I think we've ever had, this really is a major blow to someone like me who has voted for the center for many years and waited for this moment. Nevertheless, I support this government as well because the alternative, I think, was much worse. Going to a fourth round of elections in the middle of a pandemic would have seriously tested the limits of the Israeli public's ability to trust in our democratic system. I am truly worried about the future of democracy, in large part because Netanyahu and the right have declared war against our democratic institutions, and so this government has at least calmed the fever, has given us a bit of a respite. I'm relieved that Blue and White is now in charge of the Justice Ministry, has taken the Justice Ministry out of good hands, where I would call that the Likud approach to running the Justice Ministry is essentially an anti-justice ministry. They see the judicial system as a threat both to Netanyahu's personal political future and also to their vision of Israel. And so for those reasons, I support this government with a heavy heart, but nevertheless, ze ma yesh. The last point that I'll discuss in terms of where Israel is at before moving on, say some words about my book project, is the looming threat of annexation. And I call it a threat, certainly not an opportunity. I see the possibility of Israel annexing parts of the territories as dealing a major blow, not to the peace process, because there is no peace process and there won't be a peace process anytime soon, but dealing a major blow to Israel's crucial interests in several ways. First of all, to our moral credibility around the world. For 53 years, since the Six-Day War, we have managed to maintain at least some moral credibility, at least with our friends, by insisting that all options are on the table, that we are the ones who have made offers in the past that were rejected by the Palestinian leadership. And that moral credibility helped sustain Israel through the Second Intifada. It has helped sustain us through the BDS movement. And it allowed those of us who have been active in defending Israel in various forums, as I know many of you have, to do so with a deep sense of justness. And I worry about the corrosive impact on our moral stature, on our credibility. So that's in terms internally. And certainly American Jewish-Israeli relations, I think, will go through another round of finishing that process. Security cooperation with the Palestinians will be fatally threatened. Now, the Palestinian Authority was not protecting Israeli civilians as a favor to Israel. This was a quid pro quo. We were protecting Palestinian Authority leaders from Hamas. We have been keeping Mahmoud Abbas alive. We've protected him from assassination plots. And in turn, the PA has cooperated with us in keeping Hamas out of the West Bank and in saving Israeli lives. I am very concerned that if we annex, the PA will not feel that it's able to continue maintaining the security cooperation. Relations with Jordan will go through a tailspin, and the tantalizing relationships that we are developing with the Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia, I don't believe will unravel, but I fear will be on hold. And so for all these reasons and more, I see this move as deeply, deeply inimical to our basic interests. I was reading the New York Times editorial on annexation yesterday, and it was the first time that I ever recall reading a New York Times editorial and agreeing with about 90% of it. A New York Times editorial on Israel. I've never read a New York Times editorial on Israel, but I felt got the picture right. This time, I think they did. And when that happens, you know that this is a really dire situation. So let me say some words now about the book that I wrote called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which for me is really more of a project at this point than a book. The book was published about 2 years ago, and it was a series of letters written to my Palestinian neighbors, literally on the next hill from where I'm sitting now. I live in French Hill, those of you who know it, Northeast Jerusalem, the last neighborhood before the Judean Desert, before the territories. And I live in the last row of houses in French Hill, the last row of houses in Northeast Jerusalem. And from my porch, I not only see the lights of Palestinian villages, but the security wall that separates us. And so I wrote this series of letters to an imaginary Palestinian neighbor with the intention of explaining our story, who the Jewish people is, why we returned here, why we believe we are home, what my hopes are, my vision of a shared relationship with my Palestinian neighbors. And I translated the book into Arabic and offered it for free downloading, and it was published in Arabic the same day that it was released in English. And I invited Palestinians to not only read, but to respond, to send me letters. And I invited anyone in the Middle East, in the Arab world, to do the same. And I set up a website, letterstomyneighbor.com, and I began to get dozens and then hundreds of responses from throughout the Arab world. And basically, I had two purposes in writing this book. The first, very straightforwardly, was to tell our story, to tell our story to the most difficult audience possible, the Palestinian public, the Middle East, and to tell the story of Zionism, of Jewish identity, of the significance of Israel for us as a people, for me as a religious Jew, and the book is written very much from a religious perspective, as a religious Jew writing to a religious Muslim. And it occurred to me that in the 100 years that this conflict has been gradually intensifying, no one on our side had ever sat down and written, "Dear neighbor, this is who we are, this is our story." No one on our side has tried to counter the systematic distortion of the Jewish story, of Jewish history that appears almost every day in Palestinian media, that is taught in Palestinian schools. And so, first of all, this was an attempt to tell our story. Secondly, my hope was to try to model a conversation with Palestinians. I hoped that I would get responses from Palestinians and that we could then figure out how to model a respectful conversation over irreconcilable differences. Because Israelis and Palestinians will never agree about what happened and why in 1948 or 1967, which side is responsible for the collapse of the Oslo process. But I was hoping to find partners on the other side with whom I could have a conversation that would agree at least on a foundational commonality, which is that this is a conflict between two indigenous peoples, each of whom sees the entirety of this land as belonging to them, and each of whom has the right to national sovereignty in this land that we share. And in that sense, I didn't really need many Palestinian responses. I felt if I got a few good responses, I would be able to at least model what a respectful dialogue, a respectful disagreement would sound like. I got some really extraordinary responses, and they were so good that I decided to publish a new edition of the book. The book came out in paperback recently with a new epilogue called Letters from Palestinians to Our Israeli Neighbor. And this is a collection of letters. I'm very proud of these letters because it really is a unique body of work where you have a group of Palestinians, very diverse voices, arguing vehemently with my narrative, but agreeing with the basic premise that the Jewish people is indigenous to this land, and somehow we need to figure out a way where both sides can find their space. So in that sense, I would say really with the appearance of this paperback edition, this new epilogue, I've really reached the Dayenu stage of this project. I should say that I had really two audiences in mind for this book, or really three audiences. The first and primary audience, Palestinians, the Arab world. The second crucial audience for me were young American Jews. And at one point I thought I would write another book called Letters to a Young American Jew. And I realized that most of what I would want to say about Jewish identity, about our connection to the land, about the intersection between peoplehood, religion, land, ethnicity, all of that complicated web of Jewishness, which I think is increasingly difficult for young Jews to get a handle on, and which the letters book really deals with in depth. Whatever I would have wanted to say about those issues, young American Jews, I had already said in this book. And so I offered this book really to young American Jews as well. And it has really taken off in ways that I find deeply moving. I did a campus tour this past year with one of the Palestinian respondents to the book. And everywhere I went, I really felt that this book had given young Jews on campus a language for navigating their pro-Israel feelings, their pro-Israel loyalties on the one hand, and their empathy for the Palestinians on the other. And that's what I've really tried to do in this book, is model a language for us, for the Jewish community, on how to stand firmly within our own story, within our own narrative, and at the same time reach out in empathy to the Palestinians. And in that sense, I would say that what I've tried to do here is really combine what we would call a right-wing and a left-wing approach. A quote right-wing approach is, this is my story. I have no apologies for surviving. Israel has done what it had to do to survive. And I'm proud of my narrative. A quote left-wing approach is to reach out to Palestinians, to acknowledge their suffering, to acknowledge the tragedy of a people that has been shattered, and to try to reconcile. And so the language, the sensibility of this book is to really try to combine deep rootedness in our story while reaching out to the Palestinians. And that has resonated with young American Jews. Last week, I did a call for about 400 young American Jews who are reading letters in groups, in Zoom groups around the country. And this is really something that I'm deeply grateful for. Maybe I'll conclude with one story and then we'll open for conversation. A student on the University of Wisconsin published an open letter to a BDS activist in her campus paper. And she sent me the link. And the open letter went as follows. Dear BDS activist, you and I share the same commitments to social justice, but we differ deeply about Israel and I would like to explain to you why Israel matters so much to me and what I feel you need to understand about Israel and this conflict. And she proceeds to write that she got this idea for reaching out to this BDS activist from this book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And when I read that, I really felt that this was, for me, a Dayenu moment, where the book had given a young Jew on campus, on a liberal campus, the courage, the backbone, the language to take the offensive, not to sit back and wait for the BDS offensive, but to actually take the offensive, which is the implicit strategy of this book, to take our narrative to the other side, rather than to always be on the defensive trying to figure out how do we respond to BDS, how do we respond to delegitimization, and to take our story into the most difficult places. And I feel very grateful to have had the opportunity to take this book into Palestinian society. I've met with groups of young Palestinians since the book has come out. I've had friendships develop. I've been in Palestinian homes. They've been in my homes. And this is very rare in Israel. This is something that certainly since the Second Intifada was an experience that was largely denied to me. and I think it is to most Israeli Jews. And so for me, this book has really brought blessing. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to share that with you. So why don't we open for conversation on any of the issues that have been raised?
So thank you very much, Yossi. To everyone, we're going to open up the chat and you can send whatever questions you have in the chat. I'll just, as the questions are about to come in, if you don't mind, Yossi, if you could say a few words about MLI, the Muslim Leadership Initiative, and how, if in any way, it led you to engaging in this work.
Yeah, so the program that Ezra is referring to, and that Ezra has actually worked on with me and with the Hartman Institute, is called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, MLI, where we bring to our campus in Jerusalem groups of young emerging Muslim American leaders. My partner in the project is Imam Abdullah Intepli of Duke University and Maytal Friedman at Hartman in New York. And we've gone through 7 cohorts. We are over 100 participants. And we teach Judaism, Jewish identity, Israel, Zionism, the conflict. And this book could have never been written had I not had that experience. The book, well, MLI gave me a language for speaking about Israel and Zionism and the conflict to a very critical audience, young Muslim American leaders, most of whom were themselves pro-Palestinian activists, many of them BDS activists in the past when they were in college. And so I really had the privilege of being able to test these ideas out on an audience in a way that that's very rare in the Jewish world. This has really been an extraordinary opportunity. And as a result of that, I have found my own capacity for empathy with the Palestinians deepening, seeing this conflict through the eyes of my friends in the program. And also understanding what is it in our story that resonates for Muslims and what doesn't resonate. So I learned, for example, that the Holocaust doesn't, quote, work for Muslims. They feel we're manipulating them if we bring up the Holocaust. And so in my book, I left the Holocaust for the very end. It's letter 9 out of 10 letters. And that was a deliberate decision because I wanted to tell a story to Muslims, to Palestinians, to Muslims generally, about Israel and Zionism and the Jewish people that isn't based on the Holocaust.
Great, thank you. So I'll start with a question from Ari Israel, Director of Phil at the University of Maryland.
Hi, Ari. Nice to see you.
And just a moment, I'll just pull it up for 1 second. The question is, sorry, 1 second here, hold on.
Let's see, Leonid Feldman, lots of friends here. Hi, Leonid.
So there are some, quite a few actually, Palestinian Americans who are also expressing themselves in a variety of different ways. One is the author Yusuf Bashir, who's a Gazan American. And the question that Ari is asking is there any attempt, have there been any attempts, do you see any way of including or bringing his writings into a, I don't want to use the word pro-Israel, but an Israel supportive kind of conversation?
Well, it's funny you're mentioning Yusuf because I got him his publisher. I introduced him to my editor, who became his editor. So we share the same editor. And it's a terrific book, by the way. People should know about it. It's called The Words of My Father. Yusuf grew up in Gaza during the Second Intifada. It's a very powerful story. And Yusuf also wrote a letter in response to my book, which I published in the paperback. Yusuf and I have done events together, public events. And he actually is very welcome in Jewish spaces. He spends quite a bit of time lecturing to Jewish audiences. So I'm very pleased that you're bringing him into the conversation, and he's really someone that the Jewish community should know about.
Great, thank you. There are actually two questions that are interrelated. One's from Rob Goldberg, the director of the Buffalo Federation. And he asks, were there letters from those in the Arab world that were disturbing to you? And can you share an example of such a letter? And just to follow up on that, there's an additional question from Bev Mendelson, who writes that she wants to know if the book was translated into Hebrew, but she was very heartened to read most of the responses, except for the one by a young man who has lived all his life in Gaza. How do you propose to counter his narrative? So that those two questions kind of go together.
So the second question again is?
The second question is that she enjoyed she appreciated most of the responses, except one from a young man from Gaza. He spent most of his life in Gaza. That was very disturbing. And she wants to know how you propose to counter his narrative.
So I received many, many disturbing responses that ranged from rage to hate to thinly veiled death threats. And that was all par for the course. I expected that. I was largely unfazed by it. I'll give you an example of one really disturbing letter that I received. It was from someone in Ramallah, who it turns out is a spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. And he sends me an 8-page email, which is 8 single-spaced pages. And he starts off by saying, congratulations on a very successful work of propaganda. You and I both know that the narrative you're presenting here is a lie. There was no ancient Jewish presence in this land. The archaeology proves it. The Holocaust could not possibly have happened the way Jews claim it did, and on and on. And he ends this letter by saying, and in conclusion, I would be very happy to meet you for dinner and to continue this conversation in person. And I thought, wow, what do I do with this one? And I invited him for lunch. And we met in a restaurant in Machne Yehuda. And he brought an advisor to Mahmoud Abbas with him. I brought my son, and we had lunch. And what I realized in the course of this meeting is, first of all, I liked him, and we had a really good connection. And what I also realized was that he had written to me not just to debunk my narrative, but between the lines, there was a kind of a cry for help. And what he was also saying to me was, listen, I grew up my entire life with a narrative that is exactly the opposite of what you're telling me here. And so one of us got the story wrong. So help me out here. And at the end of our lunch, he said to me, when I look into your eyes, I see a man of truth. And what he was saying to me was, I don't understand how we're going to reconcile our narratives, but I realize that I have to take your narrative seriously because I take you seriously. And what that experience taught me is never give up on someone. And so what started out as one of the most disturbing stories for me ended up, in some sense, as one of the most hopeful outcomes. We've exchanged letters since, and and really developed a relationship. Now, that's just an anecdote. It doesn't say anything about the chances for peace. It doesn't say anything about the numbers of Palestinians willing to accept the legitimacy of Israel. I don't make any claims because I think that skepticism is really necessary for our survival here. But at the same time, I think we need to be open to possibility and to at least try to have the kinds of conversations that we haven't had before. As far as the second question, you know, I made a strategic decision to end the new edition of letters with the Palestinian responses and not to respond their letter. And that was a very difficult decision because this is a book that's intended to defend our story and to grant, not only to grant space to the counter narrative, but to give the counter narrative the last word was not an easy decision. But I did so for several reasons. One is to honor the courage and the goodwill of those Palestinians who responded to it. And by the way, in outside of the book, I have a very vigorous correspondence with all of them. I've responded to their letters. They've responded to my response. And so that correspondence is going on, but it's not in the book. I wanted to give them the last word to honor them. The other reason was I wanted to signal to them that I'm serious about modeling a different kind of conversation. I'm serious about hearing their story. Now, the reason, quite honestly, that I need to be ready to hear their story is because I want them to hear my story. And if I'm asking Palestinians to listen to my story, I have to be willing to listen to theirs. And so I took this step, which is I think, a fairly drastic step of giving Palestinians the last word in a book intended to explain the Zionist narrative, in the hope that this would shake things up a little bit. And it has. It has created openings that didn't exist before. I have found partners on the other side, as I mentioned earlier, people who are ready to appear with me publicly that I've never had before. And I think part of that is the goodwill that this has generated. So I don't intend to answer that narrative. I feel that what I wrote in the book is, in some sense, answer enough. And I also really wanted to send a message to the Jewish community, a subtle message, but nevertheless, a clear message, which is I'm ending this book with the Palestinian narrative because there's nothing for us to be afraid of. You know, there's this sense of almost panic that I feel in parts of the Jewish community about the Palestinian narrative. We have a great expression in Hebrew, which is Az Amru, so they said. So they said, you know, there's also, it comes from the Yiddish. So they said, and there's no reason for us to fear the Palestinian narrative. It's a strong narrative. It's a difficult narrative for us to hear. But our narrative, to my mind, is at least as strong. I personally think stronger, but at least as strong. And all we need to do is learn how to tell our narrative well. And then we can open ourselves to an empathic conversation and give space for the counter story.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Yossi, if you have a few more minutes.
Sure, go ahead.
Rabbi Leonard Feldman is asking what you think of Shorashim, Judur, with Rabbi Messenger.
Yeah, I like them a lot. I'm a big fan. Shorashim Roots is an organization that brings together Palestinians and settlers. Quite an unexpected twist. Its spiritual father was a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, the late Rabbi Menachem Froman, who was Israel's preeminent coexistence activist, Jewish-Muslim activist, Palestinian-Israeli activist, who also, rather incongruously, was the rabbi of the West Bank settlement of Tekoa. And that, the Menachem Froman is one of those Israeli stories that reminds us just how complicated the Israeli picture is, how difficult it is to draw easy lines around the Israeli kaleidoscope. And so Roots brings these two communities together in conversation, in joint activity. They've had joint summer camps. I've visited their meeting center, which is at the junction of Gush Etzion. I've visited there many times. Not long ago, about a half a year ago, I spoke to a group of settlers and Palestinians about my work under Roots' auspices. And so I'm very grateful to them. And they really model what it means to stand firmly in your story and at the same time to try to hear the other side.
There's a question which relates a bit to what you started with about Israeli Arabs and their inclusion in Israeli society in the COVID crisis. And their Rabbi Aubrey Glazer is asking, with the involvement of this population or of the mix of the populations, and 77% of Israeli Arabs who now see themselves intertwined in the state of Israel in this past crisis, could such an Israeli public space of reconciliation be spiritual rather than political or religious, which have tended to be quite problematic, or dead ends, as the rabbi mentioned?
So, hi Aubrey, nice to be on the call with you. I wouldn't make a strong distinction between religious and spiritual. This is the Middle East. It's true in Israel, we do have a spiritual space, a New Age space that is not necessarily religious. In Arab society, it's very rare. And I think that the strongest space of coexistence is the religious space here. We see it at the Hartman Institute. I've seen it certainly in my MLI project, but Hartman has other projects. We do other work with the Arab Israeli community. We have a terrific project where we bring high school principals, Arab and Jewish principals together. And this is a program where the principals study texts together, religious texts. So you can't make those distinctions here. It just won't work. You also can't separate politics from that space. There needs to be a political dimension. It needs to be a multifaceted meeting point that deals with all of the different aspects of our relationship.
There's a question from Andrea Katz, and it's a delicate question, but I think we should focus it and hear what you have to say. Why is it necessary for Palestinians to accept Israel's legitimacy? Why shouldn't the necessity and importance of this dialogue be for Israelis to accept Palestinian legitimacy?
Well, I think that it needs to be mutual, because for me, the roots of this conflict are not about a tangible line on the map, excuse me, but about the intangibles of memory, history, identity, trauma, the right to define oneself as a people, the right to self-determination. It's true that we have all the power. The Palestinians do not have the power. There is this radical asymmetry of power. But this is a very strange conflict for several reasons. One is that Israelis don't feel as if we have all the power. And the reason for that is very straightforward. Israel and the Palestinians, yes, we are Goliath, they are David. Israel and the region, the balance of power looks different. And so Israelis feel at once powerful toward the Palestinians and vulnerable toward the region. And the second reason why it's really important for Palestinians to try to come to terms with the Israeli narrative is because Israelis no longer feel guilty for the occupation. Now, many American Jews still feel guilty. Most Israelis do not. And the reason for that is the Second Intifada and the Israeli peace offers that were rejected by Palestinian leaders. Now, whether or not you agree with that narrative, it's important to understand that the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews deeply believe that narrative, as do I. And that is my narrative of this conflict. We tried to make peace, and the Palestinian leadership would not accept the legitimacy of a Jewish majority state in any borders. You can argue with me, you can tell me I have the narrative wrong, but if I really believe that, then you are not going to move me out of the West Bank without giving me some tangible proof of that there is a willingness in Palestinian society to come to terms with my legitimacy. I deeply believe that this conflict ultimately is about the Palestinian national movement's rejection of my legitimacy. And therefore, if you want to convince the Israeli public to make concessions, then you need to address this question. And that's just for practical reasons. Now, of course, at the same time, we need to begin a process of deeply confronting the Palestinian narrative. Israeli society did begin that process in the 1990s. It stopped abruptly with the Second Intifada, and it has never been resumed. My book will be coming out, God willing, in Hebrew in the coming months, and I'm hoping that it will trigger a conversation here about the Palestinian narrative. And I was waiting for the book to come out in Hebrew until I had enough of those Palestinian letters to include in the Hebrew translation, because in some ways I think that's the heart of the book in Hebrew. And so we'll see what kind of conversation that generates. But we definitely need a parallel conversation about legitimacy happening in both societies.
Actually, you just answered the last question, and that was, has your book and has your work had any effect on the Israeli political leadership? And you answered it by saying you're waiting to see what happens when it comes.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll say about that is that my book is really an expression of a centrist Israeli sensibility. It is not a left-wing book, which has confused some American Jewish readers, because if it's a book written by an Israeli about peace, then it has to be left-wing. But I'm not left-wing, I never was, and this book really comes out of the center. Now, bear in mind that there is no left-right divide in Israel anymore. That's over. The Israeli left collapsed. There is virtually no Israeli left. It exists. It exists on the periphery. The Meretz Party is still there with 4 Knesset members. The Labor Party is down to 3 Knesset members. The smallest party in the Knesset is the party that founded the State of Israel. Peace Now can't get out 5,000 demonstrators into the streets. The groups that I encounter repeatedly when I visit American Jewish communities, Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, have almost no presence in Israeli society, in Israeli discourse. And so the real debate in Israel today is between the right and the center. And this book comes out of a centrist perspective in the sense that it is wary about the intentions of the Palestinian national movement. I don't trust the Palestinian leadership, but I desperately want to reconcile with my neighbors. And it's that tension that for me really defines the center. And it is that tension that produced this book.
Yossi, I want to thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank
There were
you, Ezra.
additional comments, additional questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't have time to share them. As those of you that have heard Yossi before, and those of you that haven't heard Yossi before but now have heard him, he really represents a voice which many of us believe is a voice of reason, a voice of sanity, and a voice that doesn't always have answers but asks and presents the correct questions. So thank you very much, Yossi. And we'll be having additional Makor conversations as we move into the big question mark of the calendar over the next few months, both in the United States and in Israel. And we hope that there are more peaceful days for you in the United States, and that we can all come here and celebrate sooner rather than later, or us, I'll go there and celebrate with you. So Laila Tov, everyone, and enjoy. This will be recorded.
Thank you.
Putting up on our website, and we'll be sending out emails to all of you that have participated with the links.
Keep well, everyone. Good to be with
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lila Tov.
Toda.
Thanks a lot.
Enjoy.
Yossi.
Thank you.
Jonathan, you didn't answer my question.
What was the question?
Doesn't matter.
No, you didn't answer I put a question in there. I knew you.
I answered your question with a question, waiting for an answer. Then I was going to ask it, but it's okay.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you again.